I have often ranked the Huppermage class up there with Zellers for complexity, because if you just take a quick look at their spell descriptions, you almost feel like you need a master's degree just to be able to understand what's being said. So a few months ago, I decided to take the challenge head on and just see how complicated this class actually is. This class is amazing. My goodness, I hate the fact that I took so long to try this class out. And in this video, I'm going to reduce the learning curve and I'm going to teach you how to use this amazing class way faster. If you could do me a quick favor and just smack that like button for me, I'd really appreciate it. All right, let's do this. I gotta say, this is probably one of the most spell-balanced classes out of all the classes that I've played a decent amount. From levels 1 to 100, that has exactly 3 spells in all 4 elements. Each element has 1 AoE spell. Each of those area of effect spells are HP stealing spells, and each element has 2 3 AP spells and 1 4 AP spell. But what can make this class so intimidating sometimes is when you look at these spells and you're seeing things about states and runes. Runes are basically these little one space glyph looking like things that appear on the ground anytime you hit an enemy with an attack. And these runes will be the same color and element as the attack that was used. So an agility attack means a green rune and an agility rune on the ground. Now the state is the dot that you're going to see up here above, and it follows the same process. The state is what the enemy is now put in. So if you hit the enemy with an air attack, it is put in a green dot or an air state. Now, one thing I didn't realize when I was first starting this, you could actually play this class forever and not even think about the states or the runes that you're using and probably still have a really good time. But that would be like owning a Formula 1 race car and only driving at 40 miles an hour around the track. The real fun comes with this class when you start looking for ways to use those runes and those states. But before we go over states and runes, first let's go over the spells that you get to use. All right, so first the agility spells. First one you got here is Ether. It's a straight range spell, 3 AP, does not require line of sight, does damage, puts them in the air state. The AoE attack that you get for the agility is this transfixing gust. Now the tricky thing about this is it can only be used diagonally. So that can be a little tricky to get the hang of, but it's an AoE attack and it does agility and it steals HP for anybody that would be inside that area. All right, next up you have Astral Blade, which is your 4 AP spell. If you cast it on an enemy, you're going to do air damage and you're going to steal 3 range for 1 turn. If you cast it on an ally, they will get a 3 range buff for 1 turn. All right, next we got your fire elements. Flamethrower is pretty much the same thing. It's just a straight fire attack. It's got much better range than the Ether one did over here, but you're just going to attack with it, puts them in the fire state, and it puts a fire rune underneath of them. Burning Stroke is the AoE attack. It's going to be a 5-line space perpendicular to the range that you can cast, and it's got some decent range to it. And then any enemies within that, when you attack, you're going to steal HP back from those enemies, and it will put every enemy that it hits also in the fire state and place a ruin under every one of them. Deflagration is another one. It's got a shorter range to it. It's kind of like Flamethrower where it's a straight attack, but this one does have the ability to remove 1 effect duration. So it's kind of like got an unbewitching ability to it. All right, next up we have the Earth spells. This is Telluric Wave. It's a straight linear spell and it's just a straightforward attack. It's going to put them in the earth state with the earth ruin underneath. Storm is your AoE attack with the strength element. It's a small plus AoE. Nice thing is it's got a lot of versatility where you can cast it. It's not cast in a straight line, it's not cast diagonally, it's actually one that's pretty easy to use. It's just not as big. But you can cast this and it's going to steal HP from everything that's in that area as well as put them on the state. And Striking Meteor is very similar to the other one, but this one's going to push it back 2 spaces when you hit it. Now, for those of you who like to be right in the face of the enemies, the Chance is what you're going to want to go with on here. Very close range combat. The first one you have here is Stalagmite. It's a 1 range spell that just does chance damage. Again, puts them in the state and the rune underneath. Glacier is going to be your AoE, and it's going to be right around your character. And this is really good if you're trying to lock a bunch of people next to you. You'll get a ton of health back if you're surrounded by enemies and you cast that on them. And the last one you have here is Icy Shards, which is 4 AP AP, and it's a straight attack, but it pulls them towards you 2 spaces, because the idea behind the chance build is you're trying to keep the enemies close to you so that you can benefit from those other moves. Now, one quick downfall I'll put on here about the chance build, just so you're aware of this: between the levels of 1 and 100, Glacier is the only attack that you have that can actually hit at an angle from you, because this one is straight 1 space in front of you, and this one's a straight linear spell. So anytime you're off from the enemy 1 space, if you're a pure chance build character, you're going to be very frustrated at the fact that you can use this once and then it's on a cooldown after that, so you can't attack anymore with this element. All right, now we're gonna cover states and runes. Now, runes are a little easier to understand, but you gotta know states first, I think, to get a better grasp of how that works. So we're gonna start with states. Now, the state is an element that will be placed on an enemy when you do an attack. So if I attack with Storm, which is an earth attack, you will see a earth symbol appear above the enemy, and it is now in the earth state. If you click on it over here, you'll see that it is an earth state. Now, that earth state will continue to stay on that enemy for the entire fight unless you do something with it. And there's a few things that you can do with it. One real common thing you can do is use another elemental attack to create an effect. For example, if we were then to use Astral Blade, which is an air attack, you will see that we're going to steal 3 range. Cast it on there, you're going to see the earth state disappear. Now, if you look at the enemy, you will see that there's 3 range missing. And if you look at my stats, I have a 3 range buff for 1 turn. It's because I used an earth and then an air. Now, you can also use an air and then an earth and get the same effect. So it doesn't matter which way you go first. If it's those same 2 elements, you're always going to create the same effect, which is nice. It really cuts down on the learning curve. But each one of these elements do have a different effect. When I use the earth, if I were to use a water spell next, it's going to reduce 3 MP. If I were to use fire, it's going to suffer 15% more damage than it would if it was any of the other elements. That's why you'll hear that strength intelligence is a pretty common hybrid build, because it makes your attacks kind of buff each other. Now, don't let yourself get overwhelmed at the fact that you think, oh my gosh, I gotta learn 4 different elements and their states and their secondary effects. If you really wanted to go all out and learn all those, you could, but you kind of only need to know 2 main ones. Whatever your main element is going to be, if you're strength, you'll get to know those 3 effects really well, because that's going to be the one you typically will attack with first. Late game, if you go Omni build and you want to know exactly which ones are going to reduce damage, which one's going to take away dodge, which combination is going to steal the AP, yeah, you would have to learn a lot more at that point. But it's not something that is going to change the way you play too much. You'll be surprised at how often you aren't really paying too much attention to those secondary effects as much as you think you might when you're first starting. PvP might be a totally different battle. Maybe you actually have to pay a lot of attention to those elements. But when it comes to PvM, it's not too often you're going to be really focused on trying to make sure you steal that dodge, because the dodge is what you want to steal from that boss or whatever. It can play a small role, but you're not going to probably build your entire character and how you're going to do your spells around the minus dodge effect, if you get what I'm saying there. But there are other things that you can do with the states, and that's why I wanted to cover states first, because this is kind of how you buff your Huppermage. The Huppermage actually has almost no self-buffing spells. You're not just all of a sudden going to cast a huge HP buff on yourself or a big range buff on yourself. The Huppermage actually gets stronger once it starts interacting with the enemies. Now, I'm going to put this thing in the earth state just for an example here. A very common spell that you will use a whole lot is this elemental drain. Whatever elemental state the enemy is in, so if earth is your build and the main thing you're going to attack with, you'll want to hit with an earth spell first. Then you want to hit with elemental drain, which is a 2 AP short ranged spell, and you're going to steal a buff for yourself. You're going to do really good damage, but you're also going to get a nice buff from the drain. So my character is level 180. She gets 150 strength. Now, I believe at the first tier it's 50, and at the second tier I think it's 100 of whatever element it's in. Now, that brings up an excellent point though. If you by some chance are needing to attack in an off element, let's say that you're fighting in the 10-rail dungeon and the last one that's left there is an element that you're not necessarily built in, you can still buff yourself in that. So let's say that you're typically strength, but the last one left is agility. You can hit this thing with an agility attack come down here in Elemental Drain, and you will get an agility buff, and you can stack that up to 2 times. So you could get yourself 300 agility per turn if you kept doing that self-buffing stealing combination. Now the next one here is Tribute. Now this one, depending on what state the enemy is in, depends on what you get. If they're in the water state, you will get a straight 150 power buff. And the way you use it is you just cast it right on the enemy in the state that you want to steal from. So this one's in the earth state. You could have one in earth, one in water, and one in fire. And depending on which one you selected, depends on which of these buffs you would get. You just got to target the element that you want from that enemy. Contribution is kind of the same thing, but where this one is different is you can cast this on yourself or an ally, and every enemy that has a state on it will then contribute a buff to that person. Elemental Shield is almost the only self-buffing spell that you have for your Huppermage, but it's really cool how it works. So what you do, you cast this on yourself, and you're going to get a 20% resistance on your character for 2 turns. Every enemy that attacks you, whatever element they hit you with, you will then take a 4% reduction in that element. So if you're hit by the air element, you'll go from 20 to 16% resistant there, and then you'll go down to 12, so on and so forth. Now, I know that sounds really bad, but the cool thing is whatever element you get struck in, that elemental state now gets put on that enemy. Now let me show you why that is so significant, which I probably couldn't have really shown you in the dojo to begin with. If you're in a situation where you know you're going to get attacked by a lot of people at one time, go ahead and put on the Elemental Shield on yourself. Now every enemy that attacks you is going to get a state put on it, and it's based upon the element that they hit you in. So if it's a variety, see, we've got 2 earth, 2 air, 3 air. Now, so that I'm going to use my trick from earlier, I'm going to use Elemental Drain on one of the airs. So now there's 2 and 2. And now when I use Contribution on myself, I now have 2 AP, 2 MP, and 150 agility buff because I had that Elemental Shield. So that is a fantastic spell to use if you're going to follow it up with Contribution, especially if you got a nice variety of enemies out there on the field. Propagation is a spell where you can actually like cast it on somebody that's in a state. Our little pouch here is in the earth state. If he had other enemies that were surrounding him, I can cast Propagation on him, and it will now put the earth state on everybody that's around him. So it's a fantastic way to spread out that effect on a bunch of enemies pretty quickly. Polarity is a positioning spell, and again, it's based upon whatever state the enemy is in. If they are in the water state and you use polarity on them, you're going to drag them up to 3 spaces to you. Remember, a lot of the chance spells and build is going to be about keeping the enemy close to you. Now, in the earth state, if you use polarity on them, it's going to push them 3 spaces. A lot of the earth is going to be about trying to keep the enemy away, and as you can see, that works with polarity as well. If they are in the fire state, polarity is going to switch places with you. And if they are in the air state, polarity will teleport you symmetrically to the other side of them. All right, the last one I'm going to show you that involves the state specifically is Journey. It's kind of a distance running spell. You know, like the IOP has a jump. It's kind of like what the Huppermage has here, only every enemy that is within a state in between the point where you are and where you're going to jump, it will do damage to that enemy. Now, it's got a pretty big cooldown, so you won't use it too often, but when you do, it's nice because you can affect a lot of enemies real quick and get away at the same time. All right, now we're going to talk about the runes. And again, this I feel like is a lot easier, but knowing how state affects things, I think will be what makes this even easier to understand. Now, the runes are going to be what are on the ground. Now, unlike the state, which will stay on the enemy for the entire fight if you never use it, a rune will only stay on the ground for 2 turns and then it will disappear. And it's because there's a lot of spells that are stronger the more those that are on the map, and they don't want you filling an entire map up and then casting one mega spell with it. So this first one is called Imprint, and what this does is it will then place a rune under every enemy that has a state on it. For example, right here, our pouch has the earth state on it, but there's no rune there. Well, I can cast this, and because he's in the earth state, it will now place an earth rune under him. And if you had multiple enemies running around, every one of them that had a state would then have that elemental rune placed underneath of them. Runification, what this does is it triggers all the runes that are underneath enemies. So for our example right here, we just placed the earth rune under there. If I cast Runification on myself, it's going to do 194 damage to that enemy because of it having the earth rune under it. And the last spell I got here that's affected by the runes is called Runic Treatment. And this is a spell that does more heals based upon the number of runes that are out there. And it doesn't matter what element it is. If I cast this on myself or an ally, it's going to consume all the runes that are on the map, and it's going to do a heal on that person or myself based upon the number that are there. So it's a 5% heal if I cast it on an ally, but it's 5% per rune. So if I got 5 runes out there, it's going to do 5 times the 5% heal on that person. All right, so now some tips and tricks, and I think the best way to show this is going to be in some actual fights, because I feel like the Huppermage does better when there's more enemies to work with, because remember, all your buffing is almost enemy required. It's funny how that works. So one tip I got for you right out of the gate, especially if you are a chance build, if you can put your element on up to 3 enemies in a single turn, what I would do is use Elemental Drain on the first one, and then Contribution after that, which will then stack the other 2 on you. You can get yourself 150 chance and 300 power on turn 1 if you can hit multiple enemies with the same element from the get-go. Remember, the Runic Treatment does more heals the more runes that are on the map. So like right now, I have 3 on here. Well, if I go ahead and hit this too, to get a 4th one out here, my heal will be bigger just because there's a 4th rune out there. It doesn't matter what element it is. So even if the enemy is clear across the map over there, hit it with one of your long range spells just to stick another rune on the map so you can get even more of a heal. Whatever your primary element is, try to remember to use Elemental Drain as your second spell so that you can always get that buff. If you're in a situation where you know you're going to get attacked by a lot of people at one time, go ahead and put on the Elemental Shield on yourself. Now, every enemy that attacks you is going to get a state put on it. I'm going to use my trick from earlier. I'm going to use Elemental Drain on one of the heirs. So now there's 2 and 2. And now when I use Contribution on myself, I now have 2 AP, 2 MP, and 150 agility buff because I had that Elemental Shield and I just got walloped on there for a little while. All right, so ultimate question, which Huppermage element is best for you? Well, I'll say that all 4 elements are very well balanced, and whether you're a new player or a very experienced player, it doesn't matter which one you choose, they're all fantastic and pretty easy to understand. I would say out of the 4, Chance might have the biggest difficulty, especially at low levels because of that very short range on your spell attacks, which isn't necessarily a problem when you're getting close to the enemies. But if you got enemies that run from you and you only have 3 or 4 MP, that's going to get old really fast. And then not being able to attack around yourself very far, like at an angle, is another big limitation. Until you get your mobility up, you're going to run into restrictions with the Chance element. Strength definitely has the best flexibility when it comes to range because all 3 spells are range modifiable, but you have to remember the Storm spell is going to be on a 1-turn cooldown, and then your other 2 spells, one of them is a straight line only. So you're going to have a little bit of limitation, fantastic range, but a little bit of limitation if you are a pure strength build. I would say that intelligence and agility are probably the most well-rounded, as in they cover short range and long range. They both have pretty good AoEs, except for the agility one is at a diagonal, which might be a little tricky, but it's got a nice big area of effect, and they both have a spell that requires no line of sight, which is a nice plus also. So again, it doesn't matter if you're new or experienced, you just want to pick the one that sounds like your playstyle. Chance for close range combat, strength if you want the most long range combat, agility or intelligence if you want something kind of in between there. If you haven't already and wouldn't mind smacking that like button for me, I'd really appreciate it. Now, the next thing you need for your Huppermage, based upon how you want to play your Huppermage, is a gear setup. So click this video right here next, and I'm going to show you where you can go for building the perfect set for how you want to play this amazing Huppermage class. Until next time, you all be safe out there, and I will see you on the next one.